Newspapers during the 18th century primarily were intended to share information with readers, keep them up on what was going on elsewhere. They also would carry advertising to try from the local area to try to help, sell goods and so forth, keep people informed. So I think the roles in many ways were very similar to today in the sense of keeping people knowledgeable about events, but also, events far away as well as local events. But far away was more important because they would talk to each other on the street and find out what was going on locally, but the newspapers would let them know what was going on in, if they lived in Massachusetts, what was going on in Pennsylvania or Virginia. And so it was important as a source of information. In the years between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, the actual fighting started, the newspapers again played an important part in letting people know what the arguments were, what the issues were, and also getting them involved in standing up against Britain when they were mad about taxes or other issues. For example, the Declaration of Independence was published in every newspaper that still survives from that era, and so that's how most people found out about the Declaration of Independence. There were also essays calling on people to act. The one that I think had the biggest impact was the Crisis Essay by Thomas Paine. The first one was printed in the newspaper, and then others were and collected in a pamphlet later. But that one really got people's attention because he just really went after the British and said, we've got to, beat them. And so that really, those kinds of things happened a lot. There were also times when newspapers would try to print in a certain way that would get people's attention. I think the best example of that is one of the newspapers in Philadelphia, in response to the Stamp Act, printed its front page so it looked like a tombstone. And that was not easy because, everything had to be set by hand. The part that wasn't letters had to be carved. And so to make it look black and like a tombstone is just really amazing that somebody went to that much effort to do that. It got people's attention, and so even if they didn't know what the Stamp Act was, they started asking questions because this said, oh my gosh, this is a big thing and obviously really important if this is going to look this way. There were some people who thought they needed to be impartial, but they also thought that they needed to take the right stand. Now, part of that is a result of the 18th century is the era of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment said that man was rational and reasonable, and that if you looked at the evidence, everybody would reach the same conclusion. So, of course, I'm right and you're wrong. And so that was why the newspapers, there's the evidence, this is what we should be doing. And, that doesn't sound impartial. But they wouldn't necessarily see them as being opinionated. They were just showing that this is the way it should be. You don't have editorials during the Revolution that are clearly identified as editorials. Now, there were things they wrote that are editorials, but they're not separated. But part of that is also a result of just how it functioned, because you don't have, a publisher, an editor, and reporters. You have one person or maybe two who are printing everything, and they may be writing most of it. Isaiah Thomas wrote a lot of things for his paper, but in Boston, Samuel Adams writing things for a number of newspapers. Well, he's not a journalist, but he wrote stuff. A free press would have been defined a little bit differently back then because it would have been community-based more than everybody can have the same thing. There would be towns where the majority of the population were patriots, so they would not allow a loyalist printer to print, and vice versa. But it was important to be able to communicate the ideas that the community supported. And so, that would be an important piece. That's one of the reasons and they printed so much. There were people who had talked about free press, but they didn't define it kind of like we did, because there were people who fled because, they fled Boston because they knew when the British took over, they'd be getting thrown in jail, so they ran away. Isaiah Thomas was one of those, and then that was the way they knew how to, try to get somewhere where they could publish what they felt was important. I think, to be honest, I think the American Revolution kind of starts us down that road more so than we had before, because there was this sense of we should be able to print protests against Britain, and the British are saying, no, you can't. And so I think that helps start that process. Now, again, the Patriots didn't want the Loyalists printing things, so there was a little bit of complication, but it was a process that started us down that road in a lot of ways. During the Revolution, the newspapers were really important for getting the people engaged in the war, because, I mean, think about it, the fighting went on all over the country, but there were people who were still supporting the war even though the fighting was, you know, miles and miles away. And the newspapers played a very important part in doing that. They came out weekly or bi-weekly sometimes. And usually, I mean, particularly in times of trauma like the war, people would want to know what was going on. People subscribed to them, but people who couldn't afford to subscribe to them would go to the local tavern and somebody would sit there and read it. And so people would know what was going on even if they couldn't afford to subscribe to the paper. Although the wealthy people and the influential people are probably the ones who sparked it, the majority of the troops were, you know, not of the wealthy class. And the initial fighting was done by the local militia, which every adult man had to be a member of the militia. And so at Lexington and Concord, that's who turned out against the British, was the local militia. And so everybody was involved in that. Now, once they created the Continental Army, it was a little different because people volunteered for that. But the bulk of the soldiers are working class, what we would call working class people. You know, they're not wealthy people. When the war ended, I think the role of the press, it's still keeping people informed. There are issues about, okay, what kind of government are we going to have? How do we put all that together? And there were some real arguments over that, because some people didn't really see a centralized national government like we ended up with. And so that took a while for people to talk through that. And I think the newspapers played a role in getting the debate going and getting people thinking about it. And another piece of that, when we get to the constitutional era, I mean, the Federalist Papers are known as the most important writing about the debate over the Constitution, and usually we see it's a book. Well, it was originally all newspaper essays. It gets collected as a book later. And so they all get published individually as essays in the newspapers, and that gets people thinking about, okay, these issues of what's involved and so forth. The press during the American Revolution was an essential part of the victory, because it kept people informed, but it also just kept them engaged, interested in the war, even if it was, you know, miles away. And I think that's a key piece, because there are times when you think about it, how on earth did we beat the British? They had the best army and the best navy in the world. They were much bigger than we were. So how did we manage to do that? Well, one of the pieces of that was the newspapers keeping people engaged, willing to keep fighting.